Were you wondering whether the audio for that clip was working or not? Where was the ringing noise? When you see an alarm clock ringing, do you expect to hear a sound associated with it as well? Meyer et al. Reflected on this notion in 2010, investigating the subjective experience of sound and centering on the notion that the brain may hear a sound that wasn't actually presented. Or in other words, they researched whether the auditory cortex would activate to a visual stimulus as if its accompanying auditory stimulus was present as well. For example, perhaps the subject would witness a video of an alarm clock ringing, but no actual sound of ringing. Would their auditory cortex be activated in anticipation of an all too familiar ringing sound? This plays into a larger question of whether perceived sounds have stimulus-specific representations in early auditory cortices. The extent to which early sensory cortices are involved in perceptual illusions has been researched through examining activity in primary visual and somatosensory cortices, which has been shown to correspond more closely to the subject's visual experience than the actual physical properties of the presented stimuli. For instance, take Machnick and Hanglin's 2006 study on rhesus monkeys as an example. The researchers were interested in knowing whether the early visual system was activated in response to physical stimuli or generated perceptions of physical stimuli. To test this, they used optical illusions in order to dissociate the stimulus from the perception. Under one condition, the monkeys were presented a visual stimulus, and under the second condition, they were presented the same stimulus along with an optical illusion that flanked the original stimulus, making it seem like it disappeared. The conditions shown separately generated activity in the cortical surface, but during the illusory condition, optical signals generated by the original target disappeared, even though in reality the image persisted. The results of the study showed a correlation between primary visual cortical activation and a perceived stimulus, but not with the physical stimulus. Another study that investigated cortical activity and perceptual illusions was Watkin and Sham's study using high-field fMRI in humans. They presented a brief visual flash accompanied by two auditory bleeps, but subjects would incorrectly perceive it as two flashes. As expected, they found that activity in the retinotopic visual cortex was increased by having concurrent auditory stimulation, irrespective of any illusory perception. However, when the auditory stimulation gave rise to illusory visual perception, so the auditory bleeps made the subjects believe there were two flashes instead of one, activity in V1 was actually enhanced. These results confirmed that responses in human V1 reflected subjective perception of the stimulus rather than a physically present visual stimulus, and that responses in V1 could be altered by sound.
All things considered, the content specificity of auditory cortex activation during perceptions of sound has not yet been demonstrated. This is what Meyer and his colleagues aim to investigate. The research question was, does the early auditory cortex have stimulus-specific responses to purely visual stimuli? Objectives included determining whether subjects would discriminate between different types of stimuli, such as animals, instruments, and objects, and whether the stimuli would evoke different levels of activity within the early auditory cortex. The researchers were interested in confirming an activation during silent visual stimuli with no paired auditory stimuli in order to see if the brain will activate during a visual stimulus in anticipation of an accompanying sound. Meyer and his colleagues hypothesized that there would be category-specific patterns of activation in the auditory cortex in response to evocative visual stimuli.
8 subjects watched silent video clips while lying on a 3 Tesla Seisman magnetron trio system that acquired the images. Each clip was 5 seconds long and depicted events that implied sound. The clips were projected onto a rear projection screen that subjects viewed through a mirror mounted on the head coil. The researchers recorded 5 of the 9 video clips. The remaining 4 were taken off the internet. The subjects were able to rate the video clips at the end of the study on how much the clips evoked sound in their mind. However, during the study, they were unaware of the purpose behind the videos. There were 9 videos that were split into 3 categories. The categories included animals, which showed a mooing cow, a crowing rooster, and a howling dog. The next category included musical instruments, which consisted of a violin being played, a bass being played, and a piano key being struck. The last category was objects. This category included silent videos of a chainsaw cutting a tree, a glass vase shattering, and a handful of coins being dropped into a glass. The videos were categorized for 2 reasons. The first being because the researchers were curious to see whether the auditory activity patterns would show that the categories have similarities causing specific patterns that could be told apart.
The second reason being that if categorical representations did exist, they would be able to use this information to create more detailed organizational maps of the auditory cortex.
A sparse sampling scanning paradigm was used to ensure that the video clips were presented during scanner silence. A whole brain volume was started 2 seconds after each video clip finished. The researchers used this delay because observations in other subjects had shown that the hemodynamic response recorded from the auditory cortex in response to sound stimuli reached its peak around 4 seconds post-stimulus presentation. It was found that the sound-implying events in the study occurred towards the end of the 5-second video, so the stimulus paradigm was aimed to capture auditory activity at its highest point. The classifier was trained for 7 of the 8 runs, with the final run being used as a test run. During each functional run, the 9 video clips were presented 3 times each in random order. Since subjects completed 8 functional runs, there were 216 video clip presentations. The region of interest was Heschel's gyrus, which was chosen because it only activates for auditory stimuli.
Multivariate pattern analysis of the fMRI data was used, as MVPA uses pattern classification algorithms to identify the distribution of neural representations associated with specific stimuli or classes of stimuli. Each voxel is analyzed together, as opposed to the traditional univariate analysis techniques, which views voxels individually. This method was used so that researchers could identify a specific perceptual representation based on the pattern of neural activation in a region of interest. They found that the auditory activity patterns did show category specificity. They also found that the videos participants rated as more evocative of sound showed a stronger pattern of activity, and therefore their classifier was more reliable on those trials.
An additional experiment was completed in which 4 of the subjects participated. This experiment exposed the subjects to auditory stimuli that matched the sounds implied by the video clips. For this experiment, the classifier was trained for just the visual stimuli, then tested on the audio stimuli and vice versa. The classifier was unable to significantly distinguish between categories when just the audio clip was played, suggesting that there is a difference between heard sound and implied sound.
The results are important in this area of research because they show that our perception of vision and audition are not completely separate processes. Seeing something is linked to hearing it as well. The paper also supports the theory that we perceive a whole object instead of separate aspects of that object, and that the auditory cortex is organized to differentiate between categories of sounds. Previous studies of the auditory cortex have shown the perception of implied sounds. However, this is the first study to show that there is content specificity associated with these activations. The conclusions drawn in this study are limited by the methods used. The sample size of the entire experiment was only 8 people, and the number of participants in the second part of their study dropped to 4. This small sample size limits the generalizability of the results. Also, we struggled to interpret information from the subjects because no descriptive statistics were included about the participants. For all we know, they could have been 4-year-olds. Finally, the article itself was unstructured, and the hypothesis was hard to interpret.
The findings in this paper provided a basis for future research. For example, the results of the study could not conclude that the activity pattern induced by the implied sound is the same as the pattern induced by the sound itself. However, they did find that when the classifier was trained for visual clips only, it could successfully differentiate between animals and object sounds in only half of their participants, which realistically meant only 2 of them. Unfortunately, since the participant pool only consisted of 4 people, there was not enough evidence to draw a significant conclusion. A future study could repeat this part of the experiment with a larger sample size in order to determine if the hint of success from the study could be replicated.